tax status. And the recording is now in progress. 501c3 is a tax status, not a business model. And so, we include everything from those very small entities up into our major health systems and everything in between. So that's part of why this is so difficult, I think, for a lot of people to basically get their head around. So I tend to think that those data are useful. I know with my board that was useful to say, do you realize, this is not just a spare time occupation. We are core infrastructure to our communities, to our lives, to the economic health of our community. The trend of outsourcing public responsibility to nonprofits, I think, has been the thing that has led us to the challenge we face now, which is, and this is, I would say, at least a 20-year trend, and that is governments at all levels, local, cities, counties, states, all of the things that we pay our taxes to support, to do the common good work, have been block granted out more and more to the nonprofit sector over this last generation. And I don't think that's a good or a bad thing. I think it's a good thing in the sense that you get the people who know best what is needed on the ground doing that work and actually being paid for it. But it's created this bizarre race to the bottom. And you see this now coming out in counties, especially in county boards of supervisors. I think the one in Los Angeles, the decision about 4 years ago now to set a minimum overhead rate, a minimum administrative rate, was a key step forward. We all know that, the overhead myth notion. I blame Charity Navigator and others for making it much, much worse. But sort of the miseducation of donors that an efficient nonprofit is one that doesn't spend any money on its people or its infrastructure. And that, of course, is incredibly unhealthy and false. And so we're really, we spent many years pushing back against that. And so I think that is a big part of where nonprofits can say we can do it cheaper. And the reason they can do it cheaper is because their people aren't paid as well and they don't offer benefits as significantly. And so that's the larger picture challenge I think we all face. And I'm saying it out loud, not that we don't all know this or understand it, but I think that kind of framing can still be powerful when we're talking to our colleagues and our boards and our donors. So in the midst of all that, there's a few things that I'll just call out, and we'll talk about them later. So I'm not going to spend time on them. But one of the pushback movements, and again, in addition to just the overhead, reframing that administrative cost piece as investment in the organization, is salary transparency. And this is happening across the world. This is not just a nonprofit sector phenomenon, but it is a move to essentially get out in the open what different jobs pay so that people outside of that job and that supervisor-worker relationship can actually weigh in and frankly judge, is that appropriate? And then have a conversation about what an appropriate structure might be. It also, on a purely practical notion, can save us all from wasting time and having rounds of interviews, finally making a job offer and having the person say, what? No, I won't take that. And so I don't know if everybody's had that experience, but most of us probably have. And then the folks that have gotten past some of these and have gotten to the point of changing salaries, especially at the bottom, there was a living wage movement that was very healthy. I say was just because I feel like it's fallen off a bit. The states and counties have picked it up. So that's the good news. There's a policy success there. But the most recent wave of real living wage movements was now 20 years ago, when cities and counties were really adopting much higher minimums than federal or state because they were so insignificant and they frankly hadn't been adjusted for inflation in nearly 40 years in some cases. So what that led to was some of this pushback that we had about wage compression internally, that nonprofits realized that they wanted to do that and wanted to raise the wages of their most challenged workers. But what did that mean about then what happened to the next layer and the next layer, and could they absorb the full cost? And that's one of the things we will also talk about today, which is, what is the long-term strategy? Because wage adjustment to get to a fair market rate or a competitive rate is far beyond just a one-time thing. It's about changing a culture and then ultimately about planning in a budget for a sustainable movement over years. And I don't really know of a counterexample where it's taken less than that. And then finally, that's framed in a challenge we have seen right here in our own community, which is that poverty-serving organizations addressing poverty, whether at its symptoms or at its root causes, are unfortunately, in many cases, also in the position of creating poverty amongst their own workers. And of course, that irony is mind-boggling for many, and it drives a lot of us crazy when we see it. But at some level, if you've been in the executive director, president, CEO seat, you understand why certain kinds of funding streams do not give you the room to do what you know is right. And so how do you get around that? What other things are available to us to make that change? And of course, the other overlay, and we will talk more about this later, is the current chapter of the DEI, DEIJ work. So what does all of this mean about equity in a bigger sense around race in particular, but also around gender and ability and all the other things that we're sensitive to in the sector? And are there things we can do internally, whether they be big or small, that actually will start to have our organizations better match our communities and our client bases? And so that's something that we'll spend some time on as far as strategies that people have tried and have worked. I'll end up by just saying there's a couple of bits of data that are out there. Most people are aware of these, but I find more often than not, this is the other thing I get asked for is, hey, Geoff, I heard you knew of this particular resource. Can you send it to me? And there are some of us that spend a lot of time on the policy and data resources. And I'm looking at our list of who's on today. And I know some of you, we know each other. But I will call out that there aren't that many. And that's why I so appreciate what the foundation recently did. The Nonprofit Compensation Associates, which is the group that for years had done the Northern California Nonprofit Wage and Benefits Survey. They stepped in when the Center for Nonprofit Management out of Los Angeles stepped away from their annual survey. Cal Nonprofits partnered with the same folks that did the Northern California do a Southern, and that came out this spring. So there is now some more recent data. It's based on 2020 numbers, it was released in 21. And then of course we have the Nonprofit Quarterly. This is probably the lesser known in our region. They actually did a national survey, which I've found useful for benchmarking. And then GuideStar and Candid, of course, have long offered up their data. The problem there is that it's only at the executive level, and it's only seen through the lens of how it's reported on a 990. And we all know how fun that is. So it's good. It's a good approximate data. It's good trend line data, and they certainly can tell us some things about benefits and trends like that. But it's not as on point and specific. I'm remembering something that Steve Windeger said the other day, and I don't know if he'll be here with us today. But they took benchmarking out of the Los Angeles area, which has some of the best. Hey, Steve, there you are, which has some of the the best data because it's a big enough sample, and actually then made an adjustment for our local region based on our housing and costs, and did a really comprehensive version of the Botanic Garden. So Steve may be able to weigh in later on some of that. But it is hard. It is hard to find the good data pool that you can lean on and then adapt it to the local relevant world in which we work. And then, of course, budget plan to make it happen. There are good trend lines in the sector. There's some good things around what's happening around gender. There's some good things that's happening around getting benefits packages more in line with other sectors. Finally, I'll just say, this only happens when the board buys into it. And that's a big part of this, is the political task of understanding and getting our boards to understand that this is absolutely critical. This is as important as anything we do. We know the cost of not doing anything because we lose people. And of course, in this moment, that's exacerbated and amplified. But there are some simple tools out there. So hopefully throughout the rest of this talk this morning, each of us can share some of those tools that we've found, as well as some strategies, and you'll hear some real life stories about some organizations. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation. I'm grateful for it. And that's all I've got to say for you right now. So I'm going to introduce, once again, the woman who came up with the title for our event today, President and CEO of Calm, and that's Alana Walczak. I'll hand it to you, Alana.
Thanks, Geoff. I don't remember the title except for the take this job and shove it part. I think we're supposed to talk about compensation strategy, so that's exciting. And I think the only reason that I'm a panelist today is because I hammered over and over with the colleagues on this call to fill out those compensation surveys. Please, 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 please. The data is only useful to us if we all fill it out. So I know many of you listening out there today did that. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that. And I just want to say too, that I'm really excited to be on this panel and to be having this conversation. Hopefully we get some good chat Q&A going later. We've just needed to talk about this and really make it much more out in the open to talk about. And what I'm going to do is try to share some of my direct experiences at Calm over the last 6 years, some of the things we've tried that have worked well, some that haven't worked as well, but so it'll be real, whatever this is that I share. But I just want to reiterate what Geoff had said, that developing a compensation strategy is long-term, it's ever evolving. I think you have to break it down into steps and really make it bite-sized, because you don't want it to be a one and done. It can't be. It has to be anchored into the organizational structure and culture. It also, as Geoff said, it requires the absolute commitment of at least your executive level staff who are going to put it in place, but you need to be engaging your board. And you have to have full board support and understanding of what we're talking about. That was a big part for me at Calm, was really talking about the significant increase that needed to happen. And I would just say it's multi-layered. As I go through all the different things we've done at Calm, you'll see it's multi-layered, multi-step. It's not always linear. You make some mistakes, so you kind of do something differently and then you move back out. But I think more than anything, you have to, or I have found, I've had to have an entrepreneurial mindset. You have to be bold and you have to be creative, because you don't just have a bunch of money sitting around. If we did, we would have done this a long time ago. So you have to think about creative solutions and incremental steps, and really creating this mindset shift. And then lastly, and hopefully we can talk more about this as we get into Q&A, I think you have to talk about compensation because our staff absolutely deserve it, but you have part of the culture shift in an organization, at least what we did at Calm, is linking it to accountability, staff accountability, and organizational objectives. You can't do this in a vacuum. You have to move from the mindset of like, we all do such good work, we just deserve more. And of course that's true, but it has to be linked to accountability and our missions, really. So I'll start out just by saying, I recognize from the get-go that Calm's a larger organization. Both Josh and I represent fairly large organizations. We have over 100 staff. We have a full-time HR director. I know some folks on this call are smaller, don't have that kind of infrastructure or resources, but I'll just share from my perspective. So when I arrived at Calm about 6 years ago, compensation was the biggest topic on everyone's minds. Anytime we did a staff survey, an anonymous staff survey, complaints about compensation came up all the time. It had not been talked about openly. It was kind of this shadow topic that no one was happy about. And the mantra really was, we wish you could pay, we wish we really could pay you more, but we can't, and we'll never be able to compete with the county. So that's where we are. Staff did not know how anyone's compensation was determined. There was no consistent approach to increases if someone got licensed or gained a certification. So compensation was really a big black hole. And when I'm talking about compensation, I'm talking about broadly defined wages and benefits. But for today's purpose, I'm going to focus mostly on wages. I would say something that I think might happen, it happened at Calm. I don't know if this is broad-based, but I think many nonprofits really beef up their benefits, because I think as a percent of overall budget, sometimes benefits are a smaller nut to crack. At Calm, we offer health, vision, dental at 100% for employees and 60% for dependents, which I've heard is really generous as compared to others. But we hadn't put as much into wages. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about how we worked on that. So the first thing when I came was really looking at job descriptions and creating a standard format for all of our job descriptions. Some positions had them, some didn't. They did not have the same content. It was hard to really measure job descriptions. Once we did that, we created published wage bands for every single position. So some of this transparency, again, it was very shadowy. No one knew what different positions earned. So we published them and made them public. We then moved from an across the board annual compensation approach to annual increases where, yay, everyone gets 3% this year because you came to work. And we moved to more of a merit-based performance management system, with really meaningful performance review metrics and those sorts of things. And I will say as a leader, that transition was pretty painful. It was a hard one to push out. I'm really glad 4 years later, so glad we did that. But it was a big transition. The next thing we really started to do is documenting compensation policies and documenting how decisions were made around compensation. We started with, base pay, how folks came into the organization, but we also started to document bilingual pay, and we began to offer stipended pay for specialized positions. And so those were stipends that were added. If someone had a particular position, it could go away if they no longer were in that position. And about this time, we also decided to have consistent wage scales throughout the county. We have offices in Lompoc, Santa Maria, and Santa Barbara, which obviously have different levels of cost of living, but we chose to have a consistent countywide approach to compensation. We had, at one point, we created a compensation task force, and this was executive level staff, but we also had 4 staff from throughout the agency that were nominated by their peers. They represented different levels and geographies of the organization. And they really helped myself and our CFO and our director of HR to think about policies really from a staff perspective. And I would say that was really quite important to have that voice in the mix. Those staff ultimately, the executive team ultimately made the decisions, but we had that interactive process. Then we updated our wage bands to include beginning, middle, and end points, which again was a painful point because we created caps. But we also made the commitment that we were going to look at these wage bands on a regular basis and move the bottom, the middle, and the top as we needed to over, as the economy shifted. And as Geoff was saying earlier, since 2017 or so, we'd always benchmarked our wages and benefits against other organizations. We did phone calls to colleague agencies to find out about their benefits or about their wage bands. We also tried to use the Southern California survey when it was in existence, but it was really difficult with LA data thrown in to pull out what was relevant for Santa Barbara. And it became, in recent years, more and more difficult to get information from other mental health organizations in our region. Folks started to be less inclined to share. I don't know what that was all about, but it was hard to really benchmark our positions. So I began talking to my board in 2019 about needing to do a much more extensive overhaul, really thinking about compensation broadly defined. At the same time, they were talking to me about my salary and wanted me to tell them what I should be paid. And I felt really uncomfortable coming up with a number for them. And I felt it was their job to do some research, benchmarking my position. And the way I approached it with my board was putting it all together. Really, that we needed to engage a consultant to look both at CEO compensation, side by side, all staff compensation. And I know our friend Dina is on the line. I got recommendations from several different people, but Dina was one. And we hired a consultant that we worked with in 2020. And we ended up implementing a strategy overhaul that took probably 6 months, sometime before the consultant actually began working with us. But we ended up investing $500,000 towards salary upgrades at Calm. We have a $9 million budget, so that just to give you some sense of size and scale, how much we put into this. And that took effect, as I said, July 1. Thanks for the subtle prompt, Dave. So I have lots and lots to say about how we implemented CEO compensation as well as staff, but I only have 3 minutes. So on the CEO side, I'll just say that we benchmarked, we selected 10, 12 other organizations in the state doing similar work. We used 990 data. I was a little disappointed in that, but that was what the consultant recommended actually as a best practice. Consultant and I discussed the difference between my role and the role of those colleagues in those 10 other organizations. We had a compensation task force of our executive committee, and the consultant worked both individually with me as well as with that committee and then sometimes all together. And I'd be happy to tell you more about that. We ended up with an adjustment in my base pay, but we also, for the first time ever, started to look at bonus pay for the CEO, which is not something that we ever talk about in the nonprofit sector, but it was something that was really, really focused on by our consultants. So I'm happy to talk more about that. And then on the all staff, we use national data, similar, it sounds like, to what you may have done, Steve, but then looked at comparing it back with local regional data. We created these wage bands, we upgraded them, and we beginning, middle, and end points, but we had to look at every single person in our agency from this equity lens. This is where the work came in, to really see where they were in relation to that benchmark. And we had to make adjustments and right-size them if they were above or below where they needed to be. So a really important part of all of this is creating a compensation philosophy document. And if you haven't created one of those, I highly recommend that. It really gets you thinking about the values of how you want to structure your program. It should be put into your employee handbook. And you have to, we have also upgraded how we do performance management. We rolled out at the same time a very new growth performance system. We'd like to be cool, so we're calling it the GPS, growth and performance system, but it's a quarterly check-in rather than just an annual review. And I'll just end by saying most of our staff in this adjustment got between 5 to 16% increases on their wages. And it's not enough given what we're going through now. So we're seeing this as just the first step in a long-term process. And maybe I'll end there. I'll just say, from my experience in this work, consistency and communication were probably the two most important things that we utilized. You cannot over communicate about compensation. People get scared when you even bring it up. So you have to continuously talk about it, and you have to be consistent in your approach with policy changes and metrics. I will now pass the mic to Josh.
Thanks, Alana. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Friday morning. I try to take about the next 7 minutes here to walk you through some of the things we've done at Alpha Resource Center over the past year plus, and some of the principles and ideas that we've utilized to get there. So I am the new guy in this group. I've only been the ED at Alpha for 2 years now. Came on about 1.5 years before that as part of succession planning, but I was on the board for about 7 years prior. So I've got a very interesting perspective on what this looks like in terms of board relationship, as well as how you work with the staff. I came into a culture that was still kind of wrapped up in that old notion that somehow if you work for a nonprofit, you should be sacrificing because the mission is so great. And I don't really think that's where any of us want to live. So, our staff is our greatest investment. They are our product. They're the hands and feet of what we do. And it's what I tell them all the time. And if we don't invest in them, then what we're really doing is we're shortcutting our mission. And I think that's something we've had to train our donors. We've had to really teach our board about. I'm a huge proponent that employees in the nonprofit sector shouldn't need the basic needs services that we offer. So food insecurity, housing insecurity, there's no reason why our team should be utilizing those. We should be paying them what they deserve. And we pat them on the back and we talk about how amazing they are, but we don't always back it up with our actions. So what we did is I jumped in right away and started kind of looking at what some of the issues were. Our industry, specifically supporting people with developmental disabilities, which is the work we do, has a lot of state funding. That's our biggest funding source. Then we've got some donors. We have our thrift stores. You probably know the Alpha thrift stores. We run those as well, which gives us a really interesting perspective on this, because we're part of the retail world. So when you see what's going on with Target and Walmart and all those places, we live in that world. We also live in this nonprofit side with that mission focus of supporting the participants within our programs. And overall, the whole industry has been underfunded because the state hasn't increased the monies they've given us for about 2 decades. The newest budget, it's great. It's got some more stuff in there. It has some workforce development, some investment there, but we've just been really behind. So wages have stagnated with that. If we did 3% raises, it would have been great. Most of the years it was somewhere in that 0 to 2%. And the reality is that means everybody's getting a decrease in wages every year. We're not even keeping up with the cost of living. So the buying power of our teams just continue to go down and down each year with those types of increases. So what we did is we engaged the board at the beginning of this. We're committed in our strategic plan. I think Geoff mentioned this a little bit earlier, the idea of the living wage, which in Santa Barbara isn't even $20 an hour. And I think we all know that at $20 an hour, you're going to still struggle. But we kind of set that as our target, that at some point, everybody in our organization would get to that point. The board adopted that in the strategic plan. As I said, they've allocated resources from our reserves to help us make some of the jumps that we're making. So we built it into the budget, but at the same time said, hey, this is new for us. We may not be able to get all the way there. And so the board has kind of given us that backup funding to make sure that we can get there. And in reality, we have to understand that even, I think, not just on our retail side, but even on our mission side, with what's going on with Costco and Target and Starbucks and all these other industries, we are very much in competition for a broader group of employees. That they don't have to come to do the low-paying jobs that we can do. In fact, a lot of our jobs are difficult. They have high stress. There's a lot required of them, and you can go do easier work at places. So we really need to consider, I think, what the employees have available to them as we look at what we're offering. That having a great mission doesn't suddenly make your fear of meeting basic needs disappear. And I think we've all seen distracted employees, especially during the pandemic, when you're worried about where you're going to eat and whether you can make rent. You don't do a whole lot of good things at work, which is understandable. We've got humans that we're employing. So we started by doing small adjustments. Alana had hinted at this. This is a process that you go through along the way. So we started by addressing kind of our entry level and lowest paid staff who were well under what they should be paid because of the way things have gone for a long time. And we did one move early on in the pandemic where we just moved that whole group up. It stopped with a lot of our managers and kind of mid-level staff. And then we did a second increase recently where we weighed the wages just across the board. We didn't go quite as far as Calm. Everyone got at least 3%. There were some people that went up kind of into that 5 to 7, maybe 10% range. But it was the goal to slowly start moving there. And we've let our staff know along the way that we recognize what's going on. We recognize they've been underpaid. We recognize that we've been telling them they do a great job and then not living up to that by paying them. We've also talked a lot about the fact that we're not moving as fast as we'd like to. If we could instantly jump to where we wanted to be, it would be fantastic for about 2 months until our organization folded because we couldn't support it financially. So we're upfront with what we want to do and the reality that we're not there yet. And it's gone a long way just being transparent with the staff about the fact that we're frustrated with this and that we recognize their frustration is rightly placed. So part of what we've done in that as well is create new ways for our team to make more money. We've kind of got a different way than what I'm hearing is going on at Calm. We have moved away from the traditional wage scale. So where you've got those levels and that kind of midpoint and the upper and the lower. We had quite a few people that were capped out at one point because they had been with us for so long. They'd been with us for 15 years, 20 years. So they just hit the top and there was really no place to go with them. We also had a lot of people who weren't making that much because their wage scale was so narrow. In fact, we had this wage scale that had job titles that were there just so you can move up in the wage scale, but didn't really necessarily have extra responsibilities with them. So it became a problem in the sense that we would change a title just to change a wage. And then we would only have so many people in those new roles. So some of our newer staff didn't really have a great way to move up and to make more money. So what we've done is we've gone to more of a kind of a broad bucket. So we've got an executive bucket, a management bucket, which is that other group of exempt employees, a supervisor's bucket, which is then the non-exempt, so that next level of non-exempt, and then just a general staffing bucket. And within these buckets, there's a broad range and there's some overlap between them. What we're trying to do is avoid, we hear this a lot where you've got to become a manager to make more money. And what I don't want to do is I don't want to take the people whose natural skill set is to be with our participants, and it's amazing for them, and they flourish, and force them to take on responsibilities that aren't theirs just so that they can make a living. So we've kind of taken that approach to this of whatever value you bring to the organization, we want to pay you back for. And your value might not be in a management position. It might be the hands-on day-to-day one-on-one supports for one of our participants. And so you should be able to make a living doing that without having to move into a job that's not really for you. So what we've done then is we've changed everything where there's two ways that you get paid. One, you get an increase. One is just that base increase. So if you're meeting the basic requirements of your job, you're going to get that 2%, 3%, whatever that number is. And then we have additional increases on top of that, which aren't built out of merit. They're actually built out of personal development activities. So what we found with our old reviews is that managers are very subjective in how they pick 1, 2, 3, and 4. And no matter how many times we told certain managers, hey, 4 exceeds expectations, and all they do is show up to work on time, and you gave them a 4, that it just didn't matter. So we could have one person who, was a 3.7. They were spectacular. Everything was above expectations. And somebody else is a 2.5 because their manager was super strict. And we realized this is just not going to ever work this way. And what we really wanted to foster was people seeing this as a career, wanting to grow themselves, wanting to gain skills that would make us as an organization better, make them better at the jobs that they do. So we kind of threw out the merit idea, and what we've brought in, and this is all very early on, so I'll have to get back to you at a later point of how well it's going. We've just kind of implemented a lot of these things recently. It is this idea of development activities. So it's classes in the city, college, adult education, it's other trainings. And we've had a lot of staff jump on this because you earn points for that. And so you move from maybe the 3% and you get a couple points, and now you can get a 5% increase. And what we feel is that this adds immediate value for us. We know that we're moving people up the pay scale who are investing in themselves and therefore bringing more value to our organization. And so we're really excited about that kind of thing. On top of that, we've kind of expanded our benefits. So similar to Colin, we have the health, dental, vision, retirement. We do not cover anywhere near as much as you guys do, a much smaller percentage of that. But we did add this year a retirement matching contribution, which we hadn't done for a while, which went over really well. It's kind of free money that you just don't get up front. The way that we did it is we're matching, 0.5% for every 1% you donate up to 3% of your salary. So if you get to 6%, we'll give you 3%. The reason we went with that model is because we have a lot of lower paid staff who think they can't afford this. And what we want to do is push them to a bigger number. We don't want them to stop at 3%. We really want to get them there. Long term, I'd love to see us get into helping with education costs, with childcare, with the types of things that can be really attractive. I do think that's going to take more partnerships within our system, but that's where we're going with that. So we did all that, and then let me back up just a little bit to what we're doing with those reviews now. So how do we do the reviews if we're not going to go based on merit? So what we've done is we kind of have these, what I got in here, 6 parts, I think it is. We outline the duties that we're reviewing you on, make sure that the expectations are very clear for everybody. We then talk about the highlights of the previous year, things that have gone really well, things that have been great. And this is a conversation with our staff. We then get into areas for growth. And as we've told our managers many times, this isn't the stuff you're doing poorly. It can be, but it can also be a continuation of the highlights. Hey, you did really well in this area. Let's look for ways for you to get even better. Then built out of those conversations, we've got goals, and then a kind of a listing of the personal development activities. And then what we do is we actually put dates on there for quarterly check-ins to make sure that we're having at least 4 conversations about this every year, 3 leading up to that yearly review. And so this is all very intentional to make sure that we're helping our teams develop themselves in the right areas, that we're talking about what they can add to the organization and therefore move up that wage scale. So the communication on this, as Alana said, is highly important. We've been super transparent, as I've said a little bit. Any bad news comes directly from me. I do not let our managers communicate bad news. They only get to communicate good news. And I try to communicate that as well to the whole organization. But if it's bad news, it's coming directly from me. The past shortcomings, the rate of growth that's been slower than what we want, even recognizing the past sacrifices and the culture that we lived in. Really pointing out to people that we understand where they've been. I think it can be like I said, since I'm the newer guy to this role, I'm a little closer to the days of being in that position where you get the message back down and you react to it, and you go home and you talk to your wife and you tell them how horrible your organization is because they don't understand what you actually do. And so really trying to get into their place and recognize that and affirm that. And then pointing out the other pain points. I mean, we just went through these increases, and then good old health insurance comes around, and, you know, it goes up 6%. And it's like, great. And since we don't cover as much, it's like, you know, that raise we just gave you, for some of you, that's going to go right now to these rich guys. So it's been good. We've had a good response. It's helping us with our hires. And I think end of the day, we're going to see it help with our retention and everything else there. It looks like it's time for me to wrap up. Am I passing this back to Geoff here? I think it's your turn at this point.
Thanks, Joshua. Thank you, Landon. Thank you, Joshua. I'm only going to do a few notes here. I come from a different size organization, and so I really appreciate the complexities of if you have a staff of 100 plus. That's one reality. Obviously, staff of 2 or 3. That's another. I want to share just a brief story of where we were. So the Santa Barbara City College Foundation, we've been growing, but for us that means we're only a staff of 15. So, a few years ago we were 10, 11, 12, so now we're 15. So the what makes some things easier about that is that it's a smaller number on the whole. But folks are no less sensitive to internal equity and are they being paid enough and everything else. I think the thing that made us a little different in our reality is that when I came on board almost 7 years ago, our benefits package is outstanding, and that's because it's tied to the college. But only that is tied to the college. So we're an independent 501c3 nonprofit, just like everyone else on this call, but we have an MOU with the institution that we serve and exist in service of. But we had the opportunity to buy benefits through that relationship. So, I got here and I thought, my goodness, this is the best benefits package I've ever seen. And it was, equivalent to many larger public entity benefits packages. But, the salary and compensation had not kept pace. So our challenge was to move salary while being appreciative and sensitive to the excellent benefits. But I reminded people that wasn't frosting on top. That should be baseline human rights level benefits. And of course, that's a debate that I had to have with several folks. What we ended up doing was looking at our budget overall, because knowing that this was going to be a multi-year budget challenge, had to look at what was going to be sustainable. And of course, we at the time did not have a sustainable operating budget because we're self-sustaining. The college doesn't assist in that. And so the first job for us was to sort of signal that we wanted to move everyone up and note that we didn't want to do it and then have to fire someone as a result. We didn't have to want to lose employees as a result. So what we did is get everybody on board with the notion that if you're with us on this, if we can work together on this, let's take a long view of it, next 2 to 3 years. And we were able to do it. And some of these raises were significant, and they were 30% in I think the biggest case. And that was simply to make up for lost time. There hadn't been any system. We were just too small to have real classes and levels within a formalized structure, but we were big enough where we had to have a much more formal structure than had been previously in place. So for me, it was really 3 pieces. It was 1, get the staff to have a more transparent, we didn't disclose salary internally at that point, but just have a more transparent conversation about what we thought was fair. Get my board on board with the notion that this is going to be a major goal ongoing, that as we're stabilizing our operating budget, we have to bring up salaries. And then really start to use the data that was available. I will say that I'm very happy with where we got. We've now had 5 years of significant, consistent raises with 1 exception, and that was the COVID moment. We all froze our salaries, but we did that in an interesting democratic process. I basically worked with my finance team to offer up a couple of menu options to the full staff and said, look, this is what we can do. We have to cut back our operating budget by about $300,000. Here's one way we could do it. Here's another, and here's another. And we put things on the table like go to 3/4 time for certain positions, highest earners taking a pay cut. So we did talk about that transparently. In the end, the team voted unanimously to simply freeze compensation where it was and go for the next year plus and just leave that. And I was really happy to see that because everyone got behind that. And then of course, when we got out on the other side in a position where we could continue making adjustments, we did that starting July 1 of this year. So I've had some pretty good experience with that internal piece. I've also certainly had frustrated staff who felt that they should have moved faster and farther. So all of this comes with the package. Dave, can I share one thing on screen? I realize there's one tool. I think I have sharing capacity here. So in addition, we're not big enough. We don't have an HR director, and yet we're big enough that we need something in the way of professional help outside of the institution. And so we're right now in the midst of a conversation with a couple of local HR consultants about sort of an on-call open-ended contract for high-level HR. So this would be things like disciplinary actions, performance improvement plans, policy upgrades to our employee handbook, strategy for the long term. And my guess is that's where we're going to go because we're still not at a size where an HR director would work. But what we did do, actually, let me say one more thing. So I actually reached out to a few folks, Elena included, around compensation consultants, because I did want someone, after all these years of doing it really in-house and looking at data, we wanted someone on the outside to say, okay, so here's how it looks for somebody who does this 24/7. My board could not get on board with me for that. They didn't feel like that was a necessary expense. So we brought this back up, and now I think I've got them to the point where they say, yeah, I get it, we need to do that. So we're now just at that point, but that was probably a 6-month conversation to get folks there. In the meantime, what I want to show you is something that I cobbled together with the help of colleagues, having always believed there's nothing new under the sun, and there's always a way to do this in a grassroots fashion. So this is what I managed to construct internally as a lens for my board to look at where we were. So we simply took our 15 staff, we pulled out the median compensation, and you can see that at the top line, 73,000, and its hourly equivalent. We took the mean, which was higher, which tells you something about where the higher compensated employees skew, and then a ratio. And internal ratios is something that I used to use when I was at the Fund for Santa Barbara. I wanted to keep a real flat salary scale and some equity there. I think we're at 3-to-1 there. So here we're at 6-to-1. Then we take the same 3 measures while stripping out the highest and lowest outliers. And it gives you another sense of, okay, is that just because you have a highly compensated CEO or a very low compensated student intern? And what you can see there is, of course, median stays the same because you're stripping out one on either side, and mean decreases slightly. So these are the kinds of measures that gave my board a sense of where I was trying to articulate to them about what I felt was the goal, and then pulling those alongside other data. But this bottom piece here, you can see, health, non-cash compensation for us, and this is 2020 numbers. But that's 31% of our total, or I say it's 31% on top of our cash compensation is our benefits, and that's not actually uncommon. I know for some who offer full benefits, so it is a very expensive thing to do, but something that is very much appreciated. By the way, I did offer up on the table for our staff. This would be an area for cuts last year. They wanted to cut something, and actually the vote was to freeze cash compensation, but cut the retirement match. So that's what we did for a year. We simply eliminated our retirement match for a little over a year. So I sometimes, for me at least, those sort of specific examples are useful. So I thought I would share that. And then I'm going to be quiet here, but I do want to share one last thing, and that is all of the data that I was talking about. I want to paste it into chat here, and I'm just going to press send, and I can send this to anybody who wants to, but these are the links to the various compensation studies, the salary transparency articles that I referenced, and that includes our friend Voulet at Nonprofit AF, if you want a more fun article on it. And then so there's a national organization, some of you know, National Council on Nonprofits, and they actually have a resource page as well that has some things that I think a lot of us don't always look at, but it's useful to get a sense of what's happening around the country. Some of it more policy related.
Great.
Dave, I'll hand it back to you. Thanks.
Right on. Really appreciate all 3 of your presentations. Super, and a rich conversation happening in the chat. So thanks everyone for jumping in there and being transparent. Obviously, these are confidential conversations to the degree possible, at least in the chat. But just know this is being recorded, the actual video itself. So as we open up Q&A, And this will be posted on NPRN. So FYI. All right, here we go. So if you have a question and you'd like to speak, I can turn on your mic. Just raise your digital hand. It's right at the bottom of your toggle bar there on Zoom. Or there's been a whole slew of comments and questions kind of going back and forth and shares in the chat, which I think has been great. So any questions from our colleagues here?
I just want to share with Geoff that the chat you posted only went to us panelists. So just send it again to everyone.
I will send it to everyone. Sorry, folks. Yes, Steve.
Thanks, Geoff. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Lena. All right, now it's coming to everybody. That work?
All right. I don't see any digitally raised hands yet. And I know you're not a shy group, so I assume that you can't find a thing down at the bottom. So any questions, throw them in the chat. Otherwise, reflections, Joshua, Elena, on just some of the comments in the chat and otherwise what you've heard here so far.
Yeah, I would just say that this is really rich. And Josh, I want to go and have lunch with you because you're going in a slightly different direction. And our consultant said, you know, sticking with wage bands, beginning, middle, and end, and really benchmarking that was really, really important. I think some of what we had to do was broaden those bands tremendously. And I saw a lot of comments about, you know, where people are paying. And I think that would be a really rich conversation of just kind of what's happening. I know at Calm, we have a lot of master's levels. So our bachelor's level mental health specialists are starting at $20 an hour. Master's level with associate, you know, coming out of school, but not yet licensed, we start at 24. Licensed, which is an independent professional, they could leave Calm and go hang their shingle and go work on their own. You know, we start at 28 an hour. So these are different. These are very different wage scales, likely than many other agencies. But again, we have to keep pace with what the county pays or what hospitals pay. And, you know, I think your comments, Josh, about just in this, what was this title? Take it or shove it economy. We are competing with lots of other people. So it's not just that we never were just competing for employees with other nonprofits. We're competing with for-profits and with county entities. And so really widening that band, because the last thing you want to say to a 20-year employee, I'm sorry, you've reached the top. Thanks for your service.
Right.
You know, so we bumped our tops way up. And we're also looking at some of those other ways to compensate that you are. But I really appreciated your comments of kind of blowing up some of the tradition.
Yeah, and I think, as you've said, we're kind of in the same direction. We clearly need to consider how much people can earn and what those brackets look like. And for every organization, it's going to be different. We don't have that level of education among most of our staff. And so utilizing those tools as ways to kind of bump into different positions doesn't really work for us. And the work that most of our team does isn't distinct enough. So that's why we've taken our approach, trying to kind of offset that value that people with the same job title bring to the organization without, as we've done in the past, just having kind of made up job titles for the sake of that. But it's definitely something every organization needs to sort out for themselves.
Great. I want to make sure we jump in here. We got a couple questions. Ashley, you are muted, but you have the ability to speak. So please give your share.
Thanks. And I'm sorry if I missed this. Just what you were talking about kind of hits on it, which is, you know, I'm curious about everyone's approach when it comes to bilingual staff. You know, I've seen there be no additional incentive. There's, you know, maybe some kind of 5 or 10% increase. You know, we're really wanting to hire someone who's bilingual and bicultural to help us better serve the Lompoc Valley. And I'm wanting to make sure I incent the position. You know, we're not going to require a degree, right? Because someone just said lived experience is important. And so we're trying to find the right fit, but I want to compensate them for that as a skill set. So just curious what others do.
Yeah, we at Calm, I mean, that's a huge part. I mean, and we're going to talk about equity, but maybe I'll just jump in. You know, so lived experience is tremendously important. You know, again, for our field, certification and professional credentialing is absolutely important. And so it's both and, but language access, 55% of our staff are bilingual, most of whom are bicultural, because we really believe at Calm that you have to be of the communities you're serving. And, it's very difficult for clients, especially now in this post-pandemic world where mental health needs are skyrocketing. Many agencies just don't have that bilingual capacity. So we have really prioritized it across the county, but especially Lompoc and Santa Maria. We pay a differential pay. We determine base pay first, and then depending on role, there's an hourly additional pay. So for our clinical staff, for our master's level staff, it's a $2 an hour additional pay that we pay for bilingual, because we think it's critical. So we add it on top once we figured out if they have a specialized role or all of that, we layer it on top. And we're moving towards formalizing, it's one thing to be conversationally bilingual. It's another thing to be conversationally therapeutically in 2 languages. So we also assess for that.
Thank you, Ashley, for sharing. Steve, pulled you up on the stage. You have a question for the panel?
Well, just actually a comment as much as a question. So we found that, or I found, when we identified 2 years ago that we had a $500,000 gap in our pay scales, and that in order to be able to bring it up to what we saw was equivalent to our industry, we needed to add that, and that was back several years ago. In order to do that, we actually started at the highest level and worked our way down to some extent. Of course, we've been keeping up a little bit because of the minimum wage continuing to go up, and unfortunately, that's where our frontline workers are. But I was actually, when we were able to take advantage of some retirements and bring in new staff at the senior level, they have helped solve the problem more by bringing in more revenue than we could have done otherwise. And that's helped us then solve the rest of the problem. It's a very non-progressive approach to salary raises. It's sort of the trickle down approach, but it's really worked for us. So now across the board, we've seen about a 15% increase across the board in the last 2 years. And we're seeing that we're going to have another 25% increase overall from 2018 levels by the end of next year. So we feel like we're making progress towards that deficit we had. And I was just curious if others had a similar sort of, if they were able to do it across the board, where the money came from to increase this, and some of those kind of things of what was the approach to be able to fund the compensation deficit that you inherited or you discovered at your agency.
I mean, thank you, Steve. And by the way, I know I called you out earlier as a good example of someone who'd gone through this in a really thoughtful way. So thank you for that. I know for us, because we were dealing with a structural deficit already, the conversation with my board, we just wrapped it in. We said, to solve our actual structural deficit, it's the current deficit plus the next few $100,000 to get to where we'd want to be. So we didn't treat it separately. We sort of set it all as the collective goal and got to work. In our case, our budget is made up of about 7 primary revenue streams, none of them more than 20% of the overall, which was always also a goal to try to, we all know that the more diverse your revenue stream, the more stable it is. When something goes sideways, it doesn't sink you. So we did it that way. But again, we're kind of unusual because as a foundation, our funding streams look different than many human service agencies might or environmental organizations might. But that's how we treated it when we went out. The other thing I'll say, and this wasn't said out loud earlier, but I think we've all seen this too. We try really hard to, especially when with creating strong compensation, you're trying to create long-serving incumbencies. You want people to stay. You want people to continue to get better and grow, and with you. There's the old adage of, one person says, well, what if we invest all this time and money training them and they leave? And the counter is, well, what if we don't and they stay? And I love that. But I also want to always call out, we should be paying today what it would take us to recruit the best person into that seat tomorrow. And so many of us, and I personally, when I left my last organization, I had to have the uncomfortable conversation with my board and say, the brand new person you're about to hire, you're going to pay more than me after 20 years. I guarantee you will be paying them more. And they kind of like, oh, well, we didn't want to say that out loud, but we kind of know that now. And I said, so, so work on it. Let's work on it. So that's where we tried to do. That was the other sort of guiding light for us, was make sure that we really up salaries for those folks. And I think in my case, that was one of the biggest ones that I had a challenge with, is I had a couple of very long time staff members who'd been frozen at 1990s salary levels, and we had to get honest with that.
Steve, I want to jump in too. I think that was a great question. So a couple things. One, we did both and in terms of how we were going to compartmentalize it in stages. And we were like, well, do you do direct line staff first, or do you management? Because both are really important, because your frontline staff are critically important for your mission. But if you don't have the right managers, the efficiency of the whole operation is going to work. So luckily we were able to roll it all into our budget and to do it all at once. Again, I'm seeing it, I think you said a similar dollar amount. We did 500,000 this budget year. We were able to budget that all in. And this is where my comments about staff accountability and efficiency really, and performance really come into play, because we were able to build it into our operational workflow. And it's fitting with this cultural phenomenon right now where folks are leaving. We're seeing a higher level of output with our remaining staff, even though our overall census is down. About a year ago, we were at about 110 staff. We're now at 102, but we've provided 50% more service during the pandemic, as everyone was experiencing this trauma, again, the spiking need for mental health. So we were able to look at efficiencies. We did not get a $500,000 gift that enabled us to push it. Again, this is the entrepreneurial, creative, bold thinking. Like, you have to re-examine your business model, I think, and figure out how you might be able to operationalize it differently and reallocate your funds. And I just want to say that, yes, push money into your direct staff, absolutely. And I think we have to look at the equity issues across our subsectors. There are some sectors of the nonprofit sector that are doing better than others. Like, I know we have some colleagues here that are in the childcare arena. In traditional subsectors that are primarily female-headed, the wages are lower. We need to look at that. When I was doing my review of CEO, lo and behold, women CEOs were earning less than male CEOs. Women of color CEOs were earning even less. So we need to examine these equity issues broadly defined, because they're alive and well, and we have to. So I'd love to talk about that too, if there's any questions about equity. Even in our social service, social justice sector, inequities exist. So,
and thank you. I would say, share. Go ahead, Geoff.
The thing to note is that is one of the really good things that Candid and GuideStar started to do just a few years ago, was track gender in particular at the executive level, because they only have really executive level data, but they've done now some pretty extensive reports about trends around gender equity or lack thereof in the sector in the last few years. So the report, if anyone pulls the 2021 report, and yeah, it's not, you can't miss it. It's very much there, and of course they're looking at it at a national level.
Great. Well, those are great shares. Thank you, everybody. So we do have a few questions that we discussed in advance to kind of tee up this next section. So, as part of this discussion, and Alana started to touch on it a bit, around transparency, around, the DEIJ, diversity, equity, inclusion lens. Maybe starting with you, Alana, or if Geoff or Joshua, if you have some other additional thoughts, but can you talk about compensation as it relates to the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Like, how is that entering in, or is there some more a deeper reflection there that's worth having here with your colleagues?
Sure, I can start, and then Josh and Geoff jump in. Yeah, I think so. First of all, just from a really practical, ticky-tacky, compensation is an art, but it's also a science. Like, there is just stuff you have to do, and so these, benchmarking your positions and doing the review of how you compare externally, the The guideline is to do that every 2 years. I think if you're really looking at a DEI approach, you should be doing it every year, because the economy does not treat all of our workforce the same. So really looking at that on an annual basis. And then I think you have to do the hard work of really looking at every single person in your organization and where they fall. It takes a lot of time, but then doing the meta level of, are you seeing any trends by regional office or by gender or by race? And you have to examine that organizationally and really see if you have any issues to address. I will say that one of my, I was sharing that for mine, bonus structure became part of my compensation. I had to set goals, personal goals, organizational goals, and financial goals, a crap ton of goals now. But one of mine is around implementing our DEI work plan. So as the formal leader, if I'm not addressing DEI in structural ways, I don't get a bonus. So, tying it right back to the leadership. And I think we have to look at our educational requirements from a DEI perspective. And I think we have to look at the word professionalizing our staff, because does professionalizing mean white? So I think these are all really important conversations. And then, one thing that I've tried to do in the social service sector, but also in the mental health field in particular, again, very female dominated. I have a lot of staff who don't know how to ask for a raise, who don't know how to advocate for themselves. And so trying to coach them of how to do that in a really safe space, but giving them those tools that they have to learn how to do that for themselves. Like it's part of their own professional growth. Like we as an organization have a responsibility to bring people up, but also having to teach people those skills so that they carry that forward.
Thank you, Alana. Geoff or Joshua, anything to add?
I think you can't plan for what you don't measure. So that's one thing. And for large organizations, that takes some real time and resources. So this goes back to that overhead. Like, is this something that we're going to dedicate time and money to? I will say one of the best versions of internal salary overlay with DEI that I've ever seen was done by our partners in Sacramento. There's a statewide foundation called FCCC. And now relative to us, or most of us in this call, they're massive. So they have those resources, but they did an incredible breakdown of demographics within levels and then cross-referenced with compensation. And they made a multi-year plan and they showed trend lines. And I think so that's the Cadillac version, if you will, or the Tesla version in 2021. But you want to find a way to measure that. So we do measure our demographics and we do measure our compensation, and we cross-reference to a point. For us, it's a little fuzzier. I guess that's my interpretation, because we don't have strict structural levels. I mean, our org chart is a web that kind of goes like that. So it's a little harder to say, like managers, classing people in different ways that you would in a larger, more hierarchical structure. I noticed Lori Goodman in the chat asked me 6 to 1 as the benchmark from the highest to lowest paid, meaning my pay versus our student workers. Do I feel like that's, am I making too much? Or are they making too little? That's a constant one for me, as far as wanting to have as flat and equitable of a structure as possible, while recognizing what I need in senior folks. And of course, advocating for myself to be paid what I think is equitably. If you want to feel a lot better about this stuff, just look up what corporate America does. I just pulled up the data. And of course, this is what's really just disgusting, but the Institute for Policy Studies in 2019 said that 80% of S&P companies pay their CEO more than 100 times what they pay, not their lowest paid worker, but their median worker. And there were, in fact, the average across the largest 350 companies in the country was that it was almost 400 times. And so it's really, and we know that wealth and earnings disparity in the country is very toxic at this point. So I have a hard time figuring out what I think is right, if you will, I know not that. I want to be as far away from that as possible. But, when I get to 5 to 1, 6 to 1, I feel pretty good about that. And that's why I do the medians with a stripped out top and bottom, because in our structure, the top is me and the bottom is a lot of student workers, part-time. And so if we take those pieces out and I look at my professional staff in between, then we're down to 2.5 to 1. And that I feel really good about. But there's not a magic number. So I appreciate that question, Lori. And I do constantly think about, what kind of internal conversation could we have to come up with some guidance? 4.5 to 1, 5.5 to 1. So this is great. And yes, you should get a raise, Lori.
Let me add
please.
one quick thought here.
Yeah.
When you look at our organization, this is something we really need to grow in. We meet all the unfortunate traditional management looks very white. Our Latino population's down in the lower wage scale. On our retail side, you see this a lot as well. This is one of the reasons we're really investing in this personal and professional development. As we've tried to do internal promotions, we just don't have the skill sets there. And that's not a statement about the people and their ability. It's a statement about where they've come from and the opportunities they've had. And so that's what we're trying to do, is begin to address this by just creating those opportunities internally, making it part of their job to say, hey, let's get you the skills you need to work on a computer, to do some of these things. For us, it's even at that lower level, just writing reports and doing some of those things, people skills, if you want to move into a managerial position, and kind of finding ways to help them advance their careers internally to offset some of this.
Great, thank you. There was a question raised internally in our discussions as a team here around the Great Resignation, right? So the COVID has deeply disrupted the workforce's relationship to work, employees and the relationships to employers. And I was wondering if any of you could speak to that. Have you felt it? Have you felt the impact in your own positions? How have you counteracted or adjusted or made your organization more resilient or evolved to meet the moment there? So any thoughts there?
David, I'm sorry to do this to the moderator because I hate it when I get it done to me, but can I walk back and show one more thing? I just realized there's something that might be a simple tool that folks, so good old Google, absolutely. Good old Google Forms came to our rescue. So starting last year, we created a simple Google form that we do a regular survey. So we're kind of up to date. Now for us, when you're applying for grants, and most of you know that, it's becoming more and more common to ask about board and or staff demographics. And so this is what we've started to do and just keep it on hand. And I find myself, now that I have it, referencing the tool far more frequently. Again, it's a 15-member staff, but we do basic demographics and we ask people gender identity, age, race and ethnicity, and LGBTQ identity. And we come up with, and I know this is obviously where a lot of focus is right now, but are we matching our own community that we're serving? And this is oversimplified like it always is, but I find that it can be something that we will then pull out, like in the midst of a conversation about another policy, we can go quickly to this and overlay it rather than having to say, well, let's go back, we'll get back to you with that information. So I'm an advocate for having this kind of tool, even if it's simple, on hand. We do the same thing with our board. And it seems to help us move. When you get the right moment where those conversations are really rolling, I think we all know how disruptive it can be to say, oh, we don't know the answer because we don't have the information. Let's stop and we'll get back to you. And the moment passes. So anyway, that was just a walk back to your past question. To your current question, I'll say, I really don't have an experience with that. We have not we've actually been growing through the pandemic, but part of that was my anxiety about what if. And so we had that's why we had that much more egalitarian conversation around compensation on the outset of like, okay, we're gonna have to make some cuts. What's gonna keep people at the table? I want everybody here when this is over. How do we get to that point? And framing it that way kept folks here. So we're actually a little bit larger today than we were. And we didn't have any departures during the pandemic.
Whatever, Geoff.
That made me
whatever. Again, female-headed agency, we lost a lot of folks during pandemic because sexism is real, and family caretaking, tends to fall culturally to women. So we lost a good percentage of our workforce because of remote school and family obligations. And it's been a tough year. And we have doubled down on wellness opportunities, really trying to take care of our people. I talk about this all the time at Calm, but we do hard work in the best of times. Doing trauma work in the midst of a global trauma has been like nothing else. But the only way I get up in the morning, and the only way my colleagues get up in the morning, is we believe in our mission, we believe in our work, and we love who we work with. And so if you create, again, compensation links to culture, but culture is bigger than anything. And so I think you retain a workforce by creating a healthy culture. And there's lots of parts of that, but really emphasizing flexibility, emphasizing mutual support, emphasizing laughter and goofiness as much as you possibly can, and paying your people well so they want to stay. But I think this is a tough time. One of the things, again, I mentioned this earlier, but really we can't necessarily decrease our educational requirements on many of our positions, but we can in some places. And we're seeing, even with bachelor's or master's level requirements, we're seeing a greening of our applicant pool. It is a much less advanced applicant pool. People have, and you think about it, it makes sense. Over the last 2 years, how have people been learning or growing or attaining skills? It's a very different world. So the clinical skills right now of what people have had access to over the last 2 years is very different. So we are dealing with, so not only have we had transition in workforce, we're just seeing a very different level of skill in our workforce. And so we have poured tons of resources into internal training and professional development. That's been a really big focus. We've talked at Calm, this year is an internally focused year. So we're building training capacity and cross-training capacity, because as people leave, it's not an if, it's as people leave, we better have things anchored in organizationally so that we don't have the one person and they leave and all the knowledge goes with them. So we've been really focusing on that this year.
Josh, anything from your end?
No, I would just echo what Alana said. The flexibility has been really important. We haven't lost staff, but we've had to adjust to the staff that need to be gone at certain hours to pick up children, that need to miss certain days because of sicknesses. And thankfully, we've adjusted our service delivery model during this. We don't have as many people on our campus as we did pre-COVID, so it's given us the ability to be more flexible, but that's been the key. And then in some ways, we've been benefiting from this. So in our industry, you've got what we do, which is kind of the day services, and then there's a lot of residential services as well. And we've actually been getting some great staff from the residential side because they're getting totally burned out trying to cover 24 hours there. And so because of where we are, it's been kind of a win for us. I know that our win is somebody else's loss, but we've been okay through this portion of the time. We're kind of on the other side of this exodus to all of the people looking for something different.
Yeah. I was just going to second or now third that as well. I think that was probably one of the biggest struggles for us was how do you balance flexibility and accountability in the long term? We were happy to be super flexible when pandemic hit. We were all forced into it. On our staff, a third are parents and a quarter are single parents. So we all knew that we needed to be really flexible and work with folks to keep them here if we wanted that. And we did, and it worked so far. I think going forward it's a big question for us. And I guess I feel clear on what I think the right balance is, but not everybody on the team is on the same place. So there's some definite internal debates around flexibility and why certain folks have that. And there's folks that consider that not being accountable. And so, I've said this before, I was one of those old school, there it is, flexibility plus accountability equals long-term success. That's algebra right there. I was a there is no such thing as remote work person before the pandemic. I was very much a grumpy old man on that. And so obviously I learned a few new tricks through the course of this, and that's great. And now the question is, so what do we do? Now that we've learned those tricks and realities, how do we enshrine them in policy and cultural norms in a way that's healthy? And that's what I won't say by any means that we figured it out, but I definitely would second Joshua and Alana that was key to keeping people on board.
Shakira, thanks for joining us up on stage. You want to?
Thanks for hosting this, David. Thank you so much to NPRN. This is amazing. The question actually is for Geoff. Geoff, could you describe maybe with either, with an unmasking example, or just elaborate a little bit on the statement you made around the individual or individuals who were not in support, did not feel that it was fair, or that folks would be working remotely, post, and I don't want to add language to what you said, so I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially those who didn't agree that remote work was interwoven with accountability. Could you speak to that?
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Yeah, it remains an issue here. I think it's less so at the back end of 18 months of remote work. So for context, we are a partner to the college. Our office space is on the college campus. And so when the order came down in March of 2020, my message to the college leadership at the time was, we are happy, we're much more flexible. We're smaller than you. You're at 1,100 employees, we're 15. You decide what's right, and we'll help you be consistent. We'll be consistent with your policy. And to answer the specific of your question, Shakira, this had been an issue for the prior couple of years before the pandemic, because we have staff who are single parents without a lot of childcare options. And so this was actually quite a hot topic pre-pandemic, about what is fair around somebody's work schedule being broken up in their day, bringing young people to the office when needed. Is that only in emergencies? Is it something we can do for a couple hours, a couple times a week? Is it? And the divide was very much between those who had children and those who did not. And it wasn't everybody. It was just a handful of folks who said, I don't think that's fair. Just because I don't have children, does that mean I have a much stricter life than you do? And I won't get into the particulars of what people do and don't understand about it, having children. But that was the debate. And so on one hand, the pandemic cleared some things up, because suddenly everyone had to be remote and had to be flexible, and we had to have some level of trust about accountability. We had to have people making sure the work was getting done. And we didn't always see it. And so there was some conversations that had to be had. Now on the backside, I think the way it shows up now is a debate around what is sort of the minimum in-office footprint, and does it have to be the same for everyone? I think for me, the challenge was we have probably 3 positions on staff that, in my opinion, were better in the remote environment than they ever were in the office, because the environment, the tools, whatever it is, their style, their personality, it just worked really well for them to have their own space that was familiar at home, and they got incredible work done. So to what extent can we base it on that? Is it fair to say, well, you do really good remote work, so you can stay remote. You over there don't. So I need you in the office 5 days a week. Is it a minimum floor? Right now, what we're doing is a 2 days a week floor for staff. I'm trying to come up with a policy where we don't have any exceptions. We're still struggling with that. And so we're balancing mirroring the college, the realities of family responsibilities, being a parent, and then the work that needs to get done. And that's messy. So I think what I will say is that the debate around, is it fair for folks with families for whom they are solely the responsible adult to have some more flexibility, has seemed to become more accepted, that yes, that is reasonable. But that work day is not going to look the same as somebody who's, solo and has their home and their office space to themselves at all times. So. I don't know if that helps, Shakira, but that's sort of the flow of the debate in our organization right now.
Great. We have one last question from Steve, and then obviously we've only got a few minutes here, so let's keep it brief, and then we'll close up for the day.
I'll just keep it brief. So again, it's hard to be a gardener at the Botanic Garden if you're working from home. And so there are some positions we have, whether they're our gate admission staff or others, that you just can't work remotely. And there is some perception amongst that crew that those other folks who can work remotely are getting off easy or something. And so what we've tried to do is give a tremendous amount of flexibility. So I have some gardeners that work a split shift. They come in for some period of time in the morning, they go home and pick up kids or care for kids, and then come back and work later into the evening. And that has helped to address some of that. It doesn't work perfectly because if you are a gate staff member, you have to be present while we're open. But for some of our gardeners that are longer time positions that are a little bit more, they're actually at a higher level, that has at least helped. So that's just one of the things that we try to be as flexible as possible and gotten away from that we all have to be at work at the same time. And then really tried to work with everyone to optimize their work schedule to the extent possible. So that's just my comment.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been a super rich conversation. And as a reminder, except for the first 7 minutes was mostly me blabbing, it has been recorded, and I will get it up onto NPRN shortly. I want to give a big thank you to all of our panelists. Really appreciate the energy you put in here and your openness and transparency about what you're facing, and all of you in the chat who had a really neat dialogue. So we'll get this up, we'll share it. And just to be clear, unless you tell me otherwise, as far as I can tell, everything is good to be shared that was in chat, and otherwise on the video recording. We'll get that up and out. And if you have an idea for the next Executive Director Roundtable gathering, we'd like to have one more before year's end. We're considering board development, as I mentioned. And if you have another thought, please let us know. But otherwise, have a great end of your week. It's almost, today's Friday? Today is Friday, so we're almost done. So enjoy your weekend, get outside, be good to each other. And thanks again on behalf of the Nonprofit Resource Network. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all.